Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Great Shouts, Marketing Growth Interviews. I am Ed Davidson. I'm a fractional head of marketing and your host for this series. This second series, we're interviewing marketing leaders and business owners who have been through the process of moving from a startup to a scale-up. And we hope they're super useful for CEOs and founders who are at that stage and making the transition from a startup to a scale-up. And today we've got Jim Hodgkins, and he's got so much experience and a track record of exits of businesses to Adobe and to Nielsen as well. And I've had the pleasure of working with Jim both at kind of more early stage startups like Content Cal and Hike SEO, and then more mature kind of growth engines, especially at Experian, where he was MD at Credit Expert and through the marketing services arm of the business as well. So Jim, welcome.
Great to be here, Ed.
Good stuff. Okay, so the first question I normally ask as a bit of a kind of baseline is kind of a consideration of where you define when a startup moves to that scale-up stage.
Well, I would say when you've got traction, basically, because you know you've got something to scale up. So product market fit is probably the most commonly used phrase. But I think you can believe you've got product market fit anecdotally. You probably need promotion channel fit as well. Because scaling up, you should be scaling something you know is going to work at a higher scale if you invest more into it. So anecdotally, you can believe that users are telling you have a great product if you actually don't have a promotion channel that's got a viable ROI or customer acquisition cost, then it's kind of tough to move into scaling up, because what are you scaling up? So I think you need those two things, product market fit and a promotion channel fit. And that means that you can double down and invest more.
And I love the idea of kind of promotion channel fit as well. When you've kind of been working with kind of startups, is it been that kind of classic view of that 80% of the acquisitions have come from, one particular channel? And what kind of examples have you kind of seen of which channels really are kind of growth engines there?
I mean, I think it's problematic if you go through scale up and you've only got one channel providing 80%. I think you should be exploring a lot of channels, partly because your target market is using multiple channels. And if you want to, I kind of quite believe in the blend of like classical marketing theory with what a lot of people do now in digital, of like putting budgets down on Meta, Google, etc. But the latter don't really get you to where you need to be, I think, to get high category share, to get, or to be a trailblazer if it's a new product category. You've really got to drive consumer awareness in your target market, whether that's businesses or consumers. And to do that, you really need to be in multiple channels, because you want to be reaching the target market at the touch points where they're consuming media. I think also onto that, you've got the big question of paid or unpaid. So we're talking about organic. And now if you are fortunate enough to be able to drive organic growth to 80% of your acquisitions, then that's a great position to be in the short term. But you could also say that surely by scaling your marketing spend on paid promotion, you can accelerate that growth much more. I think if you're 80% in a channel like PPC or adverts on Meta, then you've got a growth problem, really, because your marginal CPA is going to be too high. And you've got to have a balance of channels that really perform well for you, and multiple channels. That's where I've seen more success.
Yeah, and to reduce your CAC there, having more of organic, which can reduce your overall kind of blended cost per acquisition, is super important. What other KPIs do you think are most useful there when you're kind of moving from a startup to a scale up? Again, is brand consideration a lot more important as you start moving into that, because that also can help reduce your direct response cost per acquisitions?
I mean, I think there's a lot of KPIs you can track, and I've been a big fan of tracking KPIs, as you probably know. The most successful businesses I've known have tracked KPIs intensely. And I'd say it's fairly common that if I come across a business that isn't tracking KPIs, it's because they're not doing much.
Mm.
It's actually that their activity rate is too low at what they're doing, either leads generated, meetings attended, or whatever. And there's kind of two things that seem to fit together for me. We're not really tracking that well, and we're not performing that well, and we're not trying that hard in terms of what I would call good rates of execution of different activities, versus businesses that intensively track their KPIs and perform very well, and everybody in the business knows that they've got to perform at a high level, in their chosen role. And there's a big correlation there. So I'd say if you're moving from a startup to a scale up, then making sure you've got those people who are dedicated to, in a team, who are dedicated to hitting their targets and have an aspiration for hitting high targets. Especially, I think, startups very early stage can get people in who are kind of friendly to the founder, business owner. Quite often, there isn't a lot of money to pay people. And you can get people who aren't oriented to working super hard and achieving stretch goals. And to be honest, that's what a lot of the best business growth is about. Yeah, you have to work very hard. And I think the founder at the American version of Credit Experts, when we were talking about a group of founders who'd all founded companies that went on to be 100 million plus exits to Experian, said, there's a lot of, the board thinks these guys are all inventive geniuses. They're not. Half a dozen people had their idea at least at the same time, and mostly they executed it better than everybody else. And I think that's kind of important for founders to consider. Yeah, there isn't, it's like watching Man City. They all look very elegant, but actually they're also doing a lot more work than a lot of other teams. It's not just that they can pass the ball sweetly.
And yeah, there's certainly that kind of emphasis on execution. Where have you seen teams or kind of founders kind of drop the ball on that execution? Is it, kind of mentioned the skill set of the individuals, or is it any other kind of processes that mean that people are operating in silos or not kind of executing together at the same time? Where have you seen that?
I mean, I think with founders, often they have an idea and they want to put it to market, and they're not necessarily super rounded people who've got a high amount of business experience. So sometimes it's often that people don't know what good looks like, or they feel unable to call out what bad looks like, because they are, they've got someone working for them who's telling them they're doing a good job. They're not convinced about it, but they haven't got evidence to know that. So how do you make sure everything's working really well? How do you benchmark it? How do you have difficult conversations with people where the performance is not at the level it needs to be for success? I think a lot of businesses go round in a kind of cycle for too long without addressing issues. And that's a real benefit, I think, of getting everyone involved as well in the business. I mean, I'm a big believer in like the Monday morning meeting. Once you've got the KPIs together, the whole team goes through them. It helps everybody know what's happening in the different functions. It kind of cuts down on the griping between functions, that it's their fault always, and they gain a level of understanding. But also, you kind of everybody's calling it out, and everyone's standing up for their own functions and performance in the previous week period, say. You can adapt it quickly based on that, decide what to double down on, what to stop. You get a lot earlier flags than on monthly cycles. And that's something probably if I had like key moments in my life, I went to a Monday morning meeting at a company called Lower My Bills, which was like the money supermarket of the US. in Santa Monica guested at their Monday morning meeting, and it was one of the most incredible. It was like an evangelical business experience. So many KPIs, and they were so able to change quickly to perform differently the next week. Yeah, it was a real eye opener, and I thought we had this KPIs pretty much cracked back home at the time, but they were a lot better.
I mean, sometimes companies can maybe necessarily drown in KPIs if there's too many, but as long as they operate quickly and see the correlation or causation of what's happening, and they're able to kind of change things. So it's super interesting for Learn My Bills team to be able to move that quickly and change based on those KPIs. Is there any specific ones or examples where they changed tack as a result of a change there?
I mean, I'm not sure about specifics, but I'll give you an example of how it usually works in a startup or scale up.
Yeah.
A function finds that a KPI moves really well for them, and they want to pursue it. But these things usually have knock-on effects. So let's say lead generation is 20% up, and everybody generating leads is celebrating. Yeah. Meanwhile, they're tearing their hair out in customer service because people aren't converting. Say from a trial to a paid, or they're noticing that churn is increased, and it happened coincidentally with this new channel that marketing thinks is a miracle. So, trying to tie that all up and effectively manage the debate without it ending up sounding like the Houses of Parliament, is a skill in itself. So, that they're good examples of the type of things that happen, because you rarely impact one KPI positively without it having a negative impact on another one. Price and churn, for example, or price and conversion. They all have interesting effects on each other.
And it's interesting to the lag on those particular KPIs. If you pull one lever, what's the length of time that you impact something else? And making sure that those two things that is going to happen, I think, is important as well.
Yeah.
But
one thing, you want to get too KPI centric. I think a lot of people's problems are at the strategy level. KPIs, you've got a vision, then you devise a strategy, and then you have a series of objectives, and the KPIs are designed to monitor those and tell you when you're on track. Well, you can have the biggest spreadsheet ever of KPIs, and if you're not following a strategy that's going to get you in what we're talking about now, from startup to scale up, then you're not going to win. One of those is, how do I diversify channels? How do I create a rounded marketing infrastructure that is good at everything from content production to to paid media results? And I think it's not easy to get right, because you can hire people who are senior marketers who tend to lack the doing, but they have good knowledge across channels. Then you've got to get a whole team under them. You get more junior marketers who are channel experts, but they don't have the 360 view of how what they do should fit in with everything else. And they have a high degree of self-interest as well. No one ever says the next £20,000, should be spent somewhere else other than what they're involved in. So getting the strategy right, I think, knowing the importance of investing in things with immediate payback versus building for the longer term, is probably one of the biggest lessons on this. I mean, certainly, I think a content credit expert, we were pretty good at those two. We didn't expect to get it right on our test budget elements straight away, but we were using channels at scale that we wanted to get right for 12 months' time. Because, going to, say, radio and TV at Content at Credit Expert, those were big moves. They cost a lot of money, and you can't be in a position where you've got to get it right first time, else all your core metrics are going south in a way that you look like the whole business is performing badly. You know, in Content Cow, what we did was start with, you know, we started investing in content very early, and built up, you know, a massive resource, and we got popular, and we got big attention on reviews as well.
Mm.
And then when we started laying money down on PPC and other paid channels, you know, there were a lot of places for people to go to find out about us, once they'd seen the initial advert and got awareness from it. You know, the digital world has made it very difficult to measure awareness. You know, everybody has proprietary platforms. Driving awareness is something that's, you know, above the line marketers spend all their careers doing, and now it's become a tricky thing. Everybody wants to measure engagement and conversion, but how do you get people into that funnel? And that's the thing, I think, that, you know, you've got to do that as a scale up, and you've got to have that big story.
And where do you think that brand fits within that? I mean, obviously at the early stages of a startup, there's kind of value proposition, there's kind of a mission, there's a brand there, and the ethos often kind of tied to the founder. But when do you think you kind of pull the lever of the brand? You kind of mentioned that with Credit Expert when we started doing more above the line activity. When do you think is the appropriate time to do that?
I think it varies by your market and the scale of ambition. I mean, being realistic for founders, let's say someone, I mean, there's one I was looking at the other day called Currency, where it's spelled Curren and then SEA. And, you know, they're trying to intermediate, they're trying to get into the market of the Revoluts and the Monzos with a new approach to how you do foreign transactions. So I was looking at them, and from a personal perspective, but thinking, you know, they're somewhere who really needs to have good brand marketing to create a sizable dent in that marketplace against some really big players. So you've got to go with awareness. And a lot of the biggest brands and the ones that establish themselves most quickly at really high scale, you know, they need a large amount of above the line advertising. But that isn't your typical kind of SaaS company that thinks it might sell at 10 million revenue. You literally, you know, you don't have to do that to get there. So it does depend what your objective is. You know, doing brand advertising is something that you definitely need to create a scale B2C. But you don't need to do it to create a SaaS company that fills a niche really well.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's kind of dependent on the type of company then. You mentioned the kind of team there. What's your kind of view of working with, say, agencies versus in-house? And when is it best to use, you know, agency or kind of fractional people rather than kind of using in-house resource?
I think it's a tough judgment call, to be honest. I'm not someone who thinks when I come across a new opportunity, oh, this is clear cut, we should use them. I think if you've got agencies that have done exactly what you want to do before, then it gives you a high amount of flexibility to use them. They're trusted. But equally, you know, people have, you know, people work with people they worked with previously in their career, and they trust them. I think, you know, perhaps a lesson deduced from that is if you can work with people who you can trust to get a great result, it doesn't necessarily matter whether they're an agency or whether they're an employee. It's a whole lot better than going down what is always, you know, 6 to 12 month misguided path of making the wrong hire, whichever type it is, and seeing how the performance is, and then switching it, and then getting kind of shy of doing exactly the same again. Yeah. So, yeah, I would say the more trusted resources you can use, the lower the risk.
And now, are there kind of individuals or kind of the departments which you think is necessary to scale up first? And obviously, it depends on the departments, but, you know, specifically in marketing, for example, is it better to have, you know, bring in or scale up, say, paid search, for example, or paid social because it's easier to track and you've got more accountability there? Or does it depend on what's performing at that time?
Good question. I mean, it does depend to an extent on what's performing. If something's performing and you haven't got a full-time expert on it, then getting a full-time expert is probably going to give you a very good payback. But I think one of the big issues, in funded companies scaling up is not being at full capacity, because that doesn't give you much opportunity for growth. If you're trying to create the new business, then whether that's marketing or sales, then you need more people than than are needed to kind of just cover the bases, if you like. So yeah, I would invest in stuff that's for the medium term, that is going to grow the footprint of your marketing promotion. And a lot of that is content based and achieving some level of fame in the industry that you're in. So that might be through awards entries, it might be through other forms of differentiated events, whether online or in person. But how are you going to develop the character of the organization? Because the character of an organization is very rarely conveyed in an ad, certainly not in a Google PPC ad. So there is no depth in that whatsoever. I mean, when you're tracking, so we started tracking at Credit Expert the unprompted and prompted awareness quite early on, because Experian wasn't known in the UK in those days, which people might think it has always been known now. But when I say not known, it was literally at the 2% level of, if you could name a credit reference agency, back in 2004. And we wanted to see what impact we were having and to drive that up, prompted and unprompted awareness. And then you get this depth of awareness measure, which is how many things, if people have heard of a credit reference agency, or can, will say, yes, I've heard of them when they're named Experian. What can you tell us about them? And, it's a very shallow knowledge. If someone says, oh, there's something to do with banking, for example. So what you're trying to do is grow the level of awareness so people are familiar with you and the depth that they know about your business. It's quite hard to know to generate a high depth of knowledge about why your product or service is appropriate for a target market customer if all they're seeing is ads, and especially if all they're doing is going to Google when they have a demand, because you're already down the bottom of the funnel.
Yeah, no, how much that comes down to the story behind the brand, which is more than just a pain point kind of prompt, which gives a reason to kind of trust, especially if there's a whole number of competitors that operate in the same space or offering the same service. Yeah, and I suppose that comes back to how you're building that brand awareness. In terms of the team that you mentioned there, departments as organization scales, there's potentially more conflict between departments. Before there's a smaller operating team, there's a larger team, potentially teams going to work in silos. Have you seen examples of that and make any recommendations of keeping teams together and working most efficiently?
Yeah, I've definitely seen examples. I mean, I think communication is key, not getting too siloed. And some functions, probably know that they're going to have a tough time sometimes. But you've got to be able to debate those openly and talk about them, and sometimes make tough decisions. If you have a great opportunity for promotion and it means that customer service is going to have a real tough time for that period, then you've got to engineer a way through that of what's acceptable. And if hitting the customer service response metric is the single number one thing in your company, then perhaps there are examples where that's a good thing, but I would say that's not what's going to drive your optimum growth.
You
can't be a happy family all the time. But I think some functions, you're investing ahead of the curve to grow capacity, like, it's quite cost inefficient to grow customer service ahead of the capacity required or forecast short term. And I think there's also a lot of downsides to recruiting people, when there isn't enough work to do for them, just because I think it settles people into a norm that it's not that busy somewhere. And it's much harder to upscale the number of tasks people do in a day to existing employees than it is to get people in and say this runs like that. I mean, I've seen it in sales functions where just the main problem is their activity rate. They'll be doing, a meeting a week or something, and trying to get those people to do 2 meetings a day is much harder than bringing in someone new and saying, you need to use these methods to generate leads, and the given rate of meetings is 2 a day.
I do remember your metric from Credit Expert, BHAGs.
The BHAGs. Yeah.
Do you want to explain that as a motivator for really stretch goals?
Well, firstly, I'd say to people, this works in an environment where you're kicking a lot of ass and achieving your numbers well. So I don't want to make it sound like it's something that everyone should be doing, because a lot of businesses struggle to hit their budgets, their targets, or whatever. But I think if you are, on an over performance, and especially that was an example in a corporate where the corporate didn't want to take too much risk in its budget, probably the single most successful year I'd say in my career potentially was when we grew from 6 million to 18 million revenue in Credit Expert in year 3. We went 2, 6, 18, 32, 40 something. And the corporate was never going to take that we would have like a 15 million target or something. I think they set about 10, which is what you're like 66% growth or something, 75% growth. So that was plenty high enough for them, but we thought we could do better. So we had 3 levels: a budget target, which we regarded as we were going to kill it, a target, and then the BHAGs. But we got the whole team thinking about the BHAGs internally in the business. And we had awards for BHAGs. Winning a Hairy became a great thing to do at the quarterly meetings. So you grew a culture around this super high growth, and other people in the business across wider divisions would say, why do you guys even bother? You just only have to hit your budget. And we'd think, well, we're trying to build the business as big as we can, as fast as we can. And we could afford it because we were profitable. And that's an example where you had probably 50 people working really hard who are way above target. And within the same wider Experian UK business, you'd have people who were very settled when they hit target and wouldn't want to do a lot more. So developing the right culture is key. And if that includes BHAGs, all the better.
Good stuff. I do remember those times, and it was great to be part of that culture and growth. Well, I try to keep these meetings about half an hour, so we've gone over. Thanks so much, Jim. There's so much useful content there. What I try and end with is, from your perspective, what would you say the one main reason or recommendation to a CEO or a founder who's going through that process of going from a startup to a scale up?
I think you need some fresh faces. You need to invest in people who are great at scale up. I think it's quite an easy one in a way. You can have a lot of struggle getting through the startup phase, getting the product market fit. You having a few people who are genius at doing loads of different things, but that isn't going to scale your organization. So, and there's good ways of showing loyalty to those people. Done it mostly through trying to narrow down their roles, explain to them how we need to mature as an organization, and that, let's say we've got 15, 20 people at startup stage and we want to grow to closer to 100 over 2 or 3 years. You can't have 100 people all running around all doing blended roles. But you need to get fresh talent. It's very useful for not only injecting the talent into your organization, but keeping everybody who you've got at the moment on their toes, and realizing that there are other people out there who are dependable to get great things done. You know, because overall you're trying to grow capability. Yeah. You can't, I mean, I've seen it many times. People think almost that they're gonna scale their revenues, but the capability or the breadth of people involved doing it doesn't have to change a lot. You know, but whilst there are a few examples of people who've scaled massively without increasing the size of the team by the same amount, usually you've got to professionalize functions. You've got to get the right people in who know how to do that.
Just as a bit of a bonus on that, do you have any kind of hiring tips in bringing in those new faces? Because I think sometimes existing teams or structures or founders may struggle with that.
I mean, on the budgets that I've been on, in most cases, I just hire directly or through network. My personal view is that, you know, headhunters and agencies at the levels that I've worked at, which is mostly not bringing in six-figure salary people into scale-ups, but way below that, you can find great people in the market, talk to them, suss out who you want in a much better way than if you get a shortlist off a recruiter. That's what's worked for me. Other people like to outsource that to a prepaid headhunter or whatever. I realize that, but for me, I've found a great deal of success, and I've found people who perhaps are unlikely successes. The people who were really successful 2 roles ago, but they just had a fail, and there's genuine reasons for it. And then they join, and they're so hungry to get back to that level that they become your best employee. You know, there's the other one is stepping people up that haven't done the role before, which headhunters are very loath to put people who don't have experience in the specific role perhaps a number of times, but actually finding people who are ready to step up, especially if they've got a specific knowledge base that you're after and obviously skill set, then you offer someone a promotion to come to you, and you really are making their career. You're rarely making someone's career when you offer them a job that's like a little bit more money than where they were before on roughly the same job. But,
interesting.
Perhaps I have a personal bias in that because I don't really like doing the same thing time and time again. So I can never imagine that other people might want to do that.
Makes sense. Well, Jen, thank you so much. It's been great to chat to you.
Thanks
Thanks everyone, and we'll see you in the next session.